which is somewhere between traditional war and peace. And my view is we need to get doctrinally settled there. As I said before, I think that principle number one is that an attack is an attack. Now, North Korea attacking Sony, for example, if you remember, they sank a South Korean ship. Remember they sank the Chonan? So they're capable of just doing that and trying to stay below the threshold at which, in that case, South Korea would respond to them. And we need a playbook for that below that threshold. Ditto with Russia. Now, my view of that is that that confirmed, if you needed confirmation, that Russia, unlike for the 25 years after the wall came down, when we didn't regard them as a military opponent, about 3 years ago or something, we need a war plan. And NATO needs a war plan. And some of my colleagues here from NATO, for the first time in a couple decades, because you have an understood now and basically self-declared military opponent in Russia. So I think we need that playbook, just as we need the playbook for the little green men incursions, for the stuff they do up in the Baltic states to about AI. There has to be, the challenge for that is going to be traceable accountability and a common sense explanation, so that it is possible after a prediction is made or a judgment is rendered by a machine to go back and figure out why that was right and okay. And if you can't do that, certainly I couldn't justify it in the use of violence.
There was a...
I'd just say that is an example of what must have been, I don't know the specifics, and maybe these two do, a really poor design. I mean, you shouldn't be that close.
Starting with the fact that he had his password.
Yeah, and so, I'm just speaking for defense, use of nuclear weapons, use of force, shooting down missiles and so forth. The do and don't buttons aren't right next to each other. That seemed to be the case in the state of Hawaii, and it goes back to, you're going to have lousy tradecraft in some places. These are going to be amateurishly engineered things that make mistakes.
The sophistication.
I don't know that the sophistication got as great. What I would say is we collectively didn't get much better during that period. Quite honestly, I don't think we have written that playbook. In the United States, internationally, with the technology community, we're not moving fast enough here. And I'm a big fan of priorities when the things you're talking about compete for resources. But we have to do cyber, we have to do terrorism. I was earlier today in a panel on bio threats. These are all pretty big things. They require different kinds of response, so they don't exactly compete with one another, and I don't know what ranking them really means, although I guess if you're running a conference, you need to know that. But in terms of action, if they don't consume the same resources, you got to do them all. And we have some big challenges ahead. It is, in my view, and I say this as a technologist, it is the things that make new dilemmas for humankind grow out of science and technology, because that's what creates the change. And that frontier is constantly moving, and we need to keep public goodness moving at the same speed as that technology is moving. And in many fields, and NATO needs a war plan. Some of my colleagues here from NATO, for the first time in a couple decades, because you have an understood now and basically self-declared military opponent in Russia. So I think we need that playbook, just as we need the playbook for the little green men incursions, for the stuff they do up in the Baltic states to stir up minorities.
Right.
So this is an area of warfare that they are exploiting and trying to stay below our threshold. We need to make it painful to do that kind of thing, too. Brad's excellent point. Norms and rules do matter. They're not a panacea. But in addition to the benefits that he cited, they define when a transgression has occurred, and they create, at least potentially, the possibility for collective response. So those are two additional ways that the rules are valuable. Still in all, I'm all for that. But I really do believe that we have to go back to the fact that we have governments and we have public authorities to do things that we need, and we can only do collectively. And protecting ourselves is job number one. Now, the cyber world grew up in what we now call the tech environment, which was militantly independent of government. And that was a great culture in lots of ways. I'm a technologist myself, so I understand that and relate to that. But it also meant that that particular technological revolution took place essentially in an ungoverned way. And that has one of the reasons that has led to the vulnerabilities we have, and also to the immature tradecraft in terms of protection and government response, and some resentment. I mean, you can't forget Snowden. I remember Snowden. They made government action in this area ipso facto suspect in a lot of the community that does this. Now, that's changing, fortunately, and the next generation is more understanding. I think the government's getting more deft. Governments are getting more deft at interacting with the private sector. But we need to understand that we went through a couple decades of essentially Wild West in this area, and this is one of the legacies of that. We have to gather up that.
One of the themes that I mean, what are, do you have a sense of what we are doing or should do? Or?
I certainly have a sense of what we should do. I obviously can't speak now for the government, but I think first I want to say something, if I may, about the argument I hear sometimes from Russians or Chinese, and they'll say, "Well, you do the same thing." And we don't, and let me explain what that means. We conduct espionage on the internet, and when we are spied on, I don't complain. I'm unhappy with it because I wish we were not having our secrets stolen. But I put that in a different category. Covert action is the category that we're talking about. It is not pure espionage. It has the effect of harming. Also, the Russians and the Chinese will say, well, you interfere in elections as well. You stick up for democracy. You oppose leaders who are oppressing their people or stifling their. That's true too. But that's overt. And I think it's fair to have a view of somebody else's internal politics from outside, as long as you're upfront about it. But that's different from coming in below. So I think it's important to make those distinctions, because otherwise we get this kind of manipulation from the other side, suggesting that, well, we kind of really do that too. Those are different things. Now, it's not that the United States hasn't conducted covert action over the course of its history. It is, and a lot of that has been made a matter of public record going back decades. But these are different categories. And so when it comes to something that is in the covert action category or in the non-overt manipulation of our democratic system category, I call that a common sense is an attack. Now, how do you deal with it? My view is this. An attack is an attack, and you don't have to respond to a cyber attack with cyber. You respond to an attack on you with whatever seems like the appropriate set of tools. And it may be that it amounts to something in the trade area. It may be that it amounts to something in the deployment of systems or the provision to an ally of systems that you have shown forbearance in. There are lots of ways in which, for example, in the U.S.-Russian relation, just to be clear about it, that you can tighten the screw on Russia and have to in response to this, but it's not a exact tit-for-tat kind of thing. That makes it more complicated. I understand that, but I think that's the nature of the playbook. But you do have to attribute in such a way that your opponent or enemy understands that there is a price associated with that action. And when we do nothing, it simply invites more. It invites them to turn up the dial until we can't stand it any longer. And you'd like to act before that trigger is reached, because in the case of U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China, U.S.-North Korea, and so forth, that's serious business to breach that threshold. So we need a playbook that is broader, that is not cyber for cyber. And I have some ingredients of that. Some I can share, some I can't share. But I think that is a big project ahead for our national security establishment. I also, if I may just say parenthetically, I don't mean to go on too long, that the professor made a really excellent point about installed base. And I'll give you two examples. I mean, you might think the Department of Defense must be completely up to date. No way. We had hundreds of networks, some of them decades old, and unpatchable or unpatched. And it's expensive to do that. So you can't expect most companies to be completely up to date. They're just not going to be. They're not going to have that, be able to make that investment. They're not going to have the expertise to make that investment. So there'll always be that problem of the installed base. Every once in a while, somebody says to me, do you think we could get our nuclear command and control system hacked with a cyber attack? And my only half-joking response is, it's not modern enough for that. It was designed decades ago, and it doesn't incorporate any of this stuff. It's excellent. It works, and God forbid, would work, but it's old stuff. Now, we're going to recapitalize that, and when we do, we will be using modern IT, and that'll be a real issue.
Let's talk about some